Real quick, the only ask I could ever have of you guys is to help spread the word so we can help more women lose body fat, build muscle, reach their goals, and feel insanely confident. And the only way we can do that is if you rate, review, and share this podcast. So, the single thing I ask for you to do is if you could leave a review. It will take you 10 seconds and it will mean the absolute world to me and may change the world of someone else.
This sort of idea that it's absolutely fine to routinely put young women on a medication that suppresses their hormone production. I mean, for decades now, I've just found that astonishing that that's where we ended up. It would be like, just say to young women, you don't need ovulation. Basically, you don't need your own hormones until you're ready to make a baby. It would be like saying to men, look, you don't need testicular function or testosterone until you're ready to make a baby. So we're going to shut that down. And then we're going to replace your testosterone with this medication that's like kind of like testosterone, but a little bit more, really more like estrogen. And it's going to affect everything in your body, including your brain and your metabolic health. And it's fine because that's, what we do. So that's where women are at this point.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Macro Hour. Or if this is one of your first episodes, hey, you are here on a good one. I'm really excited to be honored by Lara Briden, who is joining us here today. She is a renowned naturopathic, I always stumble on saying that word, naturopathic doctor,
Yeah.
an author, and women's health advocate. She's got over 25 years of experience in women's health, and she's become a leading voice on the power of natural solutions for hormonal health and menstrual wellness and all of that good stuff. We like to talk about all of this stuff on this podcast. So I'm really excited to have her here and to dive into her wealth of knowledge on how women can navigate hormonal changes and thrive at every stage of life. So, Lara, first, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. It's great to meet you.
Likewise, likewise. So you've been a naturopathic doctor. See, I just gotta say
Yes.
it once and then I can say
Yeah. Now you've got it.
it. You've been a naturopathic doctor for over 25 years and you've become a strong advocate for empowering women and getting them to understand their bodies more. So what sparked your interest in this field and how has your approach evolved over the years?
Yeah, that's a great opening question. I started out as an evolutionary biologist. So, way back,
Oh,
I
wow.
actually published a peer reviewed paper in sex differences in foraging behavior. So, looking back, I realized I was very interested in female physiology from almost day one, as a
Mhm.
biologist. And then I realized at some point I really want to work more with people. So, I trained as a naturopathic doctor in Canada. I'm Canadian, even though I live in New Zealand. So, it's a little bit confusing for people. Um, and yeah, and then when I started in general practice 25, 27, whatever years ago it is now, I was just in a small town in Canada and just, treating everyone. And I still treat everyone potentially, but mostly over the years, I just had more and more experience with women and particularly with women with menstrual problems, with like perimenopause, hormonal problems. As you can imagine, because back in the 90s, they really weren't getting solutions from anywhere else.
Right.
So I got to learn early on that what I'd learned as a naturopathic doctor, a lot of the nutritional approaches work incredibly well for female health. So then I was able to eventually harness that into my my three books that I have. My first one was Period of Manual, which was now almost 10 years ago.
Yeah, thank you for sending me those books too. I can't wait to dive
Yeah.
into them.
Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned nutritional approach. I cannot wait to pick your brain on that because
Yeah.
as I share with you very briefly, prior to us hitting record, women that listen to this podcast are 45, 65 years old and they're going through
Yeah.
menopause or prior to it. And I firmly always say nutrition is king and exercise is queen. But a
Right.
lot of people really struggle with the nutritional aspects. So I can't wait to pick your brain on that.
Hmm.
So let's talk about metabolic health first to kick it off.
Okay.
And you often talk about metabolic health as like a whole body project. So can you
Yes.
explain why addressing metabolic dysfunction requires a holistic approach?
Yeah, you must have read my mind this morning because it's morning here, early morning here in New Zealand. I was just, as I was getting up and having my coffee, I'm just thinking I need to do a social media post on whole body versus, a very prescriptive approach. Because of course we do see out there, it's like all you need to do is boom, 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 like point 1, 2, 3, and you're
Yeah.
good. And then people do those and then they're like, actually I'm not good. There's still something going on. So a whole body approach is very much in Period of Perimenopause, my first book. I put forward the concept that fix your health and you'll fix your period. Basically, the menstruation
Mm.
in many ways is as an expression of general health. I would say that's true also for perimenopausal symptoms to some extent. That's also true definitely for metabolic health. So I've been having conversations with fellow naturopathic doctors lately, just talking about, yeah, it's like every other condition. You treat the person and you treat metabolism. So by metabolic health, I am in my book, Metabolism Repair for Women, which is really all about metabolic health, is I'm primarily talking about sort of the very common problem of insulin resistance or metabolic inflexibility. That's what I mean by metabolic health. The term is much broader than that, and it does encompass a lot more than just insulin or the specific metabolic hormones. But yeah, I do take the approach in there in that book of, okay, you need to like look at the whole person. And I list about 24 different metabolic obstacles. Like for that individual, what is the thing that's standing between them and their current position of potentially metabolic inflexibility or difficulty losing weight or, chronic fatigue, like fatigue symptoms or whatever you want to call it, tendency to low blood sugar, and what's standing between sort of where they're at and where their birthright, what I would call where their body wants to be, which is to be metabolically flexible, which is to be metabolically healthy. There's always a way back. In the book, I call it the road home, and
Mm.
it's there for everyone, and it's not going to be the same road for everyone.
Yeah. Why does it? So there's like traditional ways you could go about it, but then there's like what I love about naturopathic doctors is you guys focus on the holistic side. Like, why would addressing these metabolic dysfunctions, like what you just said, there could be disruptions in certain processes in our body that are causing the whole body to be out of kilter. Why would that require a holistic approach
Yeah. I'll give you a
rather than
really
like traditional?
Yeah, I'll give you a concrete example. It just comes straight out of my work with patients, which all my books do, just came straight out of conversations, couple decades of conversations with patients. Um, Here's just a concrete example of what a metabolic obstacle, a big one is gut health. So
Okay.
people can be chasing, perfecting their, you know, diet, perfecting, dialing in whatever they've decided is the best, exercise for them. And meanwhile, they've got something called SIBO or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And that generates a lot of inflammation. That situation in the gut causes something well known in science called metabolic endotoxemia, which is just a gut inflammation driver of insulin resistance. So certainly I've had patients for whom maybe they're doing everything else right. I'm just like, let's just fix your gut. And we do that. And then, one of the patient stories in the book, she's like, oh, my afternoon sugar cravings that I just plagued me for years and I couldn't, you know, I was having to use willpower for years to withstand, have just disappeared in her case. That's what it can be like when fixing one thing reverberates through the system and you know sort of
Everything else kind
fixes
of
the whole
gets
system.
fixed
And it's
together.
not always that simple, and I'm certainly not saying every single person it's a gut issue. This is what I mean by troubleshooting. Some people, their gut is fine, some people it's going to be something else entirely, but gut's a really common one, which is why I find I often do talk about it in interviews, because and also an interesting thing about gut problems, it's also one mechanism by which ultra processed food, particularly ultra refined carbohydrates, tend to
Mm.
drive or promote insulin resistance or metabolic dysfunction. Of course, there's the way they stimulate blood glucose, but it's more than that. I think it's actually it's actually ultra refined carbohydrates that can um, ferment in the gut during SIBO or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth and generate a lot of intestinal permeability and inflammation. So I actually think for some people, if they go, just as an example, if they go lower carbohydrate or cut some of those refined carbohydrates, I think actually they're treating their gut as the primary mechanism that they're treating their metabolism. That's just one example.
Got it. Love that. I love that example.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people can totally resonate with that. It's like, okay, if I'm dealing with gut issue things or I recognize that my gut is off, then I take a holistic approach, which kind of is going to come into this next question that I have for you, because it is a complex like interplay of lifestyle factors, like
Yeah.
what can correlate to a metabolic dysfunction in a human
Yes.
being. So could you elaborate, and this is where I want to pick your brain on, like how nutrition, how exercise, how sleep, how stress management, like how they all work together to create a foundation for metabolic health, and why it's so critical to address them like as interconnected pieces of the same puzzle.
Yeah. Well, so I'll talk a little bit about the nervous system now as another example. And
Mhm.
just thinking, obviously, so everyone agrees. I mean, diet is important, but it's important for various reasons, not just, I'm sure we're on the same page. It's not purely just calories, obviously, or it's not even purely just, macros. There's a lot going on with diet. So, like, I do talk about food sensitivities in the book. And here's an example like someone not, and of course, many people don't have food sensitivity. So that's not an issue for them, but some people do. And for people who do have, for example, a dairy sensitivity, I do talk about that in the book. Um, that could be, creating some sort of mast cell activation or sort of histamine response, and that interacts with the immune system, and that can in part dysregulate. It's sort of a two-way street actually with something called the autonomic nervous system. I'm currently working on some new content on the autonomic nervous system. Your listeners probably know a little bit about that. This is the parasympathetic versus sympathetic sort of balance in the body.
Meaning like
And
fight or flight.
yeah,
Yeah.
and we need both sides actually. It's not like in fact the sympathetic aspect of is the sympathetic nervous system, or the adrenaline part of the nervous system, is actually quite important for metabolic health and fat loss as well. So we need both, and we need this like kind of balanced oscillation between them. This a lot of this will show up. People might be tracking their heart rate variability. That's what this is a marker of,
Love
right?
my HRV. I got it up to 160 when I sleep. I
Okay, so
freaking love
HR
it.
right. So HRV is a direct, pretty not direct, well, pretty closely to direct measure of what the state of your autonomic nervous system. And a lot of people, their autonomic nervous system has they've got things going on with that. There'd be things upstream from that that have sort of dysregulated that. I used food sensitivities as one example, but there's lots of others. And that actually has a huge impact on metabolic health. And it really does on, certainly on blood sugar balance. A lot of young women in particular can get blood sugar crashes from autonomic mild autonomic dysfunction, which is actually I didn't real I sort of knew, but until I started working on some of this recent content, I didn't actually realize how widespread mild autonomic dysfunction is in women, especially in their girls, like young teenagers, and then into women's early 20s. They do get a lot of blood sugar instability from the autonomic nervous system, and that's very different from what 45-year-old men might be getting from like
Oh,
insulin problems.
interesting.
Like it's they're very different situations.
Mm.
So I forget your original question, but yeah, the autonomic nervous system is another, really good example of a place where diet affects that, you know, stress affects that, circadian rhythm affects the autonomic nervous system. Lots of things do, and then that in turn, definitely feeds into, blood sugar control and energy balance. It actually directly feeds into how much energy you burn on a day-to-day basis. It affects hunger to a large extent. So yeah, in the chapter 4 of my new book, I do, because I'm a biologist, so I had to explore the biology of metabolic health, of course, even though
Mm.
it's complex. And early in that section, I do talk a little bit about embracing the complexity, in the sense that people do not have to, no one does, not even practitioners, I think, don't have to fully understand every single nuance or, gear that's happening in this complex thing that is metabolic health, because that would be impossible. And we can't micromanage every single aspect of it, every single hormone. We talk about leptin and glucagon, like there's just so many hormones. But we can take away, by embracing the complexity, we can just take away this understanding that by addressing one thing, like maybe avoiding a food sensitivity, for example, you
Mhm.
can have all these knock-on effects, that you affect your autonomic nervous system, and you affect therefore your you know um, energy burning systems, you affect your sleep, you affect everything else downstream from that. So that's the idea.
Yeah, so kind of to unpack that a little bit, you mentioned the nutritional aspect of things, right? It's not just calories, it's not just macros. It's also like
No.
understanding that if we have these sensitivities to things and becoming aware of the sensitivity to the things, because we can remove them, and then that can kind of play into addressing like the almost like the fix essentially, right? So to piggyback off of that, what would you say? Okay, so that would be like one streamline of things for nutritional approach is like
Hmm.
trying to figure out the puzzle pieces of which may be a symptom that's occurring in somebody that they can address to make the metabolic health better.
Yeah.
How can somebody recognize? I'm going to kind of get to that maybe in the next question, but
Yeah.
like, because there's some things that they should start to recognize and maybe something is off. Like, how would somebody know if gut health is off or they have SIBO or
Yeah.
like, you know?
Yeah. Well, so some of it'll be obviously just from symptoms. So, I mean, I have quite a big section on SIBO in my new book. Well, in all books I mention it, but in my latest one, I do the biggest discussion because it's just so common. A
Yeah,
lot of
I'm
anybody who's been
personally
diagnosed with
like
a lot of people with irritable bowel syndrome possibly have SIBO as an underlying diagnosis. Really, I mean, irritable
yeah,
bowel is such a blank, like such an umbrella diagnosis. It's really describing all sorts of different things. So, I mean, some people can just tell by symptoms, and I do list some of the symptoms of all the different potential metabolic obstacles in the book. But also, some people may need the help of a clinician to help to troubleshoot or dial in what might be the best place to start. And I do have some, as in all my books, I have little sections on how to speak to your doctor about this particular issue, or how to find out if you have gluten sensitivity. And I don't want to overplay the food sensitivity thing, because it's not certainly that's not probably the most common obstacle, but it's one that gets missed, and it's one that
totally.
I've
It's
had
just an
good
example.
results with my patients. Yeah.
Yeah, totally an example. I would love to kind of continue down that like path,
Yeah.
but I'm gonna make sure like all your books are linked, but
Yeah.
everyone can obviously go and like if they're interested in reading them and diving into a little bit more of what you're saying here and being able to read the
Yeah.
symptoms or have confidence in talking to a doctor if they're
Yeah.
recognizing any things that seem to be a little bit off. But one last question on this topic is like, okay, so let's say, for example, right? Because I think this is a good example. There's a lot of people that always ask me, like, Nikki, bring more gut health conversations to the
Right.
podcast. Um, is okay, somebody has SIBO or irritable bowel syndrome or something that's off in their gut. How can that play a factor in them not getting the results they want when if something is off, right? You mentioned insulin resistance. You mentioned like metabolic inflexibility. Like if those things are off, it's going to be harder for somebody to lose weight, right?
Well, yes. I mean,
Yeah,
quite simply, and it's hard anytime we try to really simplify something, it's to some extent oversimplified. But I will just say the main feature of insulin resistance, which affects at least 40% of the general population, certainly a much higher percentage in older people, um, is chronically elevated levels of the hormone insulin. And one of its many, many effects, is that it prevents fat loss. Basically, it basically makes it much, much harder for the body to access body fat for energy. And that has then a two-prong negative effect, which is one, it's harder to burn fat. And two, it's harder to get that body fat for energy between meals. And one important thing is that as humans, our main our mitochondria is another sort of player in all this, but our cellular
Mhm.
energy, it's actually preferred baseline kind of fasting energy source is fat. So it will, I mean, obviously after a meal, we're going to burn whatever was in the meal, including carbohydrates. And then we do have, glycogen or carbohydrate stores to tap into especially with more strenuous activity. And as you know, like we're always burning a mix of fat and carb, but in a healthy, metabolically flexible state, non-insulin resistant state, we should be in the resting fasting state burning about 80% fat. So like that should be coming from, we should be tapping it. The body's like, no problem. I've got all this. Even someone who's not overweight has a lot of fat stores to burn for energy.
Mhm.
And that's how we're designed and that's how we're built. So to lose access to that, I guess that's one of the main sort of ways I would characterize insulin resistance. It's this state of being trapped in carb burning, not able to, access the fat that your body would really like to have, not just for, body composition reasons, but just because it needs that energy. And so one of the symptoms then is of insulin resistance is not being able to go very long between meals, getting, sort of quite fatigued and reliant on carb snacking just to get through the afternoon, or in some case, maybe potentially to get through the night. I
Mhm.
am working on, like I said, I'm working on some new content around such a common problem of people getting hypoglycemia overnight and sort of needing to snack at
Yeah.
midnight. And that's not something, if that's what's happening with your physiology, as with anything, actually, I'm sure from the work you've done with women, like it's when someone's having hypoglycemia or is like really hungry or really fatigued, willpower cannot sort of help them at that point. That is past the point of they can just,
Yeah.
they need it needs to be, the treatment needs to be upstream from that to improve their energy supply to their cells in the first place, so they don't, yeah, get
Totally. Yeah.
get
Look at it as a cry for the body needing to address something
yes.
internally that
Yeah, you
uh
can't withstand. We're
happened.
animals, right? This is where my work as a biologist comes in. Like when your cells are starving for energy, as they can be in insulin resistance, and they need you to eat like a granola bar,
Mhm.
that is that can become pretty much non-negotiable at that point. That's not something people can be like, oh, I really shouldn't. It's like I'm, the cells are like, we're in trouble here. We need more energy. So
Quick break. If you're finding this episode helpful so far, it would mean a lot if you could hit pause for just a second, leave a quick rating or a review, or share it with someone who could benefit from it. Your support helps more women discover these tools to build muscle, lose fat, and feel confident. Thank you so much for being a part of this journey with me. So, going off of this, if women want to look to improve their metabolic health, what would you recommend that like? How do they start? Like, what would you say if somebody has? I don't know. I mean, it's like people should get tested first and foremost. People should get
yeah,
tested to see where. Like I just
yeah,
got recently tested, and I'm excited to the next. I'm hopping on a podcast in an hour and a half, and we're going to read my results. But it's really important to be tested to see if there are any. First of all, if you're recognizing the symptoms that you're having, you should get tested. But then from there, it's like, okay, well, how can somebody improve their metabolic health? And where would you recommend that they start? What should they prioritize first, even if they don't get tested?
yeah. Right. So I agree. I mean, I do a lot of testing with my patients. I think you have to sort of know what you're testing, have like a specific questions of what you're testing for. Obviously, I guess one of the things I do talk a lot about in the book is, well, how to test if you have insulin resistance, which is essentially the metabolic condition we've been talking about. I'll just
Mhm.
make one takeaway for everyone. Is it um, a test for blood glucose, even a test for HbA1c is not a cannot rule out normal blood glucose cannot rule out insulin resistance, because it's actually a condition
Mhm.
of chronically elevated insulin. So there's other ways to sort of look for that. So I guess that would be step one, is to figure out if you do have insulin resistance or recently had it. And then the next couple steps, I guess I'll just talk through what I would say are the next couple steps. Step two would be to accept, or like truly believe, that it is possible to have more energy and feel less hungry. And that's the metric, right? That's the goal. So if that's the proximate goal, and that is what people are aiming for, even before the number on the scale changes or anything. Like I think the only way back, as I call it, back home, the road home to metabolic health, is to fairly early on in the process have more energy and naturally feel less hungry. And that you'll have seen that, working with women, that kicks in. If you're doing the right things for that individual, that will kick in, and people will be like, oh, this is actually, that's why it's sustainable, is because actually I feel a lot better. And then step three would be, and I had to spread that out over 2 chapters, would be getting what you need. So we are biological creatures. We all of us do have a number of non-negotiable requirements, and that would include, social connection of some form. It looks different for different people, but that would include like a healthy circadian rhythm. There is a
Mhm.
lot of science suggesting that just misaligned circadian rhythm is a major driver of insulin resistance. So that's an easy one, to just using light and timing of meals to make sure you're aligned with the 24-hour cycle of your time zone.
Mhm.
And then I have a whole section on getting what you need nutritionally. And part of, we talked about how all the different ways that food will influence metabolic health. Another big one is just actually getting enough of the micronutrients. So it going a little. I mean, macros are important as well. I'm a big fan of getting enough protein. So that's I think my section on food starts with very early on. It's like get enough protein. That's an easy way to give your body something very important that it is looking for and needs. But even beyond that, like we there's all these missing macronutrients in our micronutrients in our
Mhm.
modern diet. And arguably, that's potentially a big part of the problem for a lot of people is our diet is just to a large extent stripped of nutrients that our fairly recent ancestors had. And a number of them directly support metabolic health. So again, I would consider them non-negotiable. I do talk about supplementation. I have the 5 missing metabolic nutrients that I've called them the 5 missing. There's more than 5 that are missing, but those are the big ones, I think, when it comes to insulin sensitivity
Which one
and
are they? What are
metabolic
they?
flexibility. Yeah, I'm happy to give the 5. People don't have to buy the book to get the 5. Um, Magnesium, the amino acid taurine, choline. Choline was a big one we used to get from organ meats. I'm old enough to remember back when liver was on the weekly rotation in my home when I was a kid. Um, Inositol is a second one we get, would traditionally have had from organ meat. So inositol, people might know it. It's a very popular supplement for insulin resistance and polycystic ovary syndrome or PCOS. And number 5 is glycine, which is also from animal foods. Glycine is the main amino acid in collagen. So a lot of people take glycine as collagen. You can also just take glycine on its own. And it has all 5. So magnesium, taurine, choline, inositol, and glycine support mitochondria, directly support metabolic health via several mechanisms, and also support sleep and do other good things.
Awesome. Love that. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, I mean, your books, they're all I'm excited to dive into them, and I'm of course, like I said, I'm going to link them. There's so much I'm hearing from you now, like saying it's in the book, it's in the book. I'm
Yeah.
really excited to dive in to see like specifics on like the topics that we're talking on and dive a little bit
Yeah.
deeper into them.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm going to put a pin on metabolic health.
Yes.
And I want to chat a little bit because I think this will resonate with some of the listeners that are listening. And like, the books that you're talking about that you've written, they're really impactful in helping us understand how to better understand our bodies. And one of them includes period repair,
Yeah.
which is your period repair manual. And I want to ask you a question like, because there's so many myths and there's so many misconceptions around menstruation that women have grown up with. And so, from your perspective, what are like the most harmful myths about period that you've come across? And how can debunk them here with us on the podcast and help women understand their menstrual health a little bit better?
Yeah, great question. Well, I do have a number one thing that is a weird sort of paradigm that we've got locked into in the last about 70 years. This idea that ovulation is not important. So, um, ovulation, which is obviously the release of an egg, which is we think about that for making a baby, of course,
Hmm.
but it's the main event of the menstrual cycle, and then the bleed that comes 2 weeks later is really just an inevitable result of ovulation. You're either pregnant or you have if you once you ovulate, you're either pregnant or you have a period. And ovulation is not just to release an egg, though. It's actually the engine of the menstrual cycle. It's how we make our 2 main hormones, estradiol and progesterone. So men are quirky in that they make their testosterone every day. We make our hormones on a young women make their reproductive age women make their hormones on a monthly cycle. And the paradigm, when I say 70 years, that's really how long the pill has been around. It switches off ovulation and then it replaces menstrual cycles with this induced withdrawal bleed, which means nothing. Actually, there's no medical reason to bleed monthly on the pill because it's just mimicking something. So to this sort of idea that it's absolutely fine to routinely put young women on a medication that suppresses their hormone production, I just have, I mean, for decades now, I've just found that astonishing that that's where we ended up. It would be like, to say to young women, you don't need ovulation. Basically, you don't need your own hormones until you're ready to make a baby. It would be like saying to men, look, you don't need testicular function or testosterone until you're ready to make a baby. So we're going to shut that down. And then we're going to replace your testosterone with this medication that's like kind of like testosterone, but a little bit more, really more like estrogen. And it's going to affect everything in your body, including your brain and your metabolic health. And it's fine because that's, what we do. So that's where women are at this point. I know that's maybe quite strongly worded, but I just,
No,
the more I
please,
go
I
on with
welcome
this, I'm
that.
just like,
I
what are
welcome
we,
that on this podcast. I
what are we
appreciate
doing? Like, what is
I
happening? Like,
yeah.
and so of course we're now, I think, I don't know, I'm curious to get your feedback. I mean, I think we're now finally breaking through. Like there are more and more young women just going, no, I'm not, not shutting down my ovulation. I mean, fortunately,
Yeah.
there are other methods that more, more methods are coming where women can both reliably avoid pregnancy and also keep their own cycles, which are their own menstrual cycles, their own hormone production, which just, to put it in context from a metabolic perspective, are beneficial. So our own, the estradiol that women make is anabolic. It's metabolic insulin enhancing. Like it's really, as I talk about in my third book, estradiol is to a large extent, metabolic superpower, and young women have it naturally, and that's to a large extent what actually shelters young women from insulin resistance. But unless they shut it all down with the pill, and I'll just say, like, the 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 medications in hormonal birth control are not usually not estradiol and progesterone. They're never real progesterone. There are a couple of pills that use body identical or real estradiol, but most of them use something called ethinyl estradiol, which does not have the same benefits for any part of the body, really.
First of all, I commend you and welcome those strong opinions on this podcast. I am down to have conversations, even
Yeah,
if we have opposing views, as long
yeah,
as they're, you have your opinions, I have my opinions, we both have perspectives, we can have a conversation around it. But
yeah,
this perspective, I completely 110% agree with you on.
yeah.
I, from a very young age, watched my stepmom struggle with getting pregnant, and it was because she was on birth control. Well, that was one of the reasons why we thought it was. Could be other things too as well, but um, she's on birth control from a very young age, and from that, I remember I was probably 14 years old, and I maybe even younger, and I was like, I'm making the firm decision right now. I'm never going on birth control forever at any point in my life, and I have never gone on
Interesting.
birth. Actually, I lie. I had to take it, and I nearly had a conniption. I had to take it because I froze my eggs,
Right.
and a part of the process, or a part of one of their um like strategies, because I didn't have to do
Yeah.
the second time, but the first time I did, I had to take it for 7 days. And I was like, the first day that I recorded on social media, I was like, I am freaking out. I promised myself when I was like 13 years old, I would never take this. And, but I firmly agree with it and what you're saying, because you're putting fake hormones into your body when on a monthly basis, we already generate so many of these amazing hormones that we need to be able to produce. So I hear you. And I agree with you 110%. So with that though, because there are, and I've expressed this actually at a soul episode when I talked about this, and I had a lot of feedback in terms of like, okay, if I'm coming off, and people are kind of, I think, waking up a little bit more to this perspective. If I'm coming off of birth control, many women struggle with like the symptoms when they're discontinuing this hormonal birth control. So from your perspective, like what's happening first of all during this transition, and how can women best like support themselves through it?
Yeah. Well, that's so. First of all, I wrote a whole book on that. That's period of perimanual, basically, is how to get your own cycles back without the pill. Um, yeah. So what's happening? I mean, I guess in simple terms, and again, it's always a danger in saying something simply because there's always you know, other aspects to it. But I guess in simplest terms, a takeaway would be pill bleeds are not menstrual cycles. So like whatever the regular pill bleed has looked like for the last 10 or 15 years, however long people have been on a combined estrogen pill producing regular bleeds, that doesn't mean like that means zero in terms of what the underlying menstrual cycle might be like. So with my own patients, for example, if they're wondering what are my periods going to be like when I come off the pill, my first question is, well, what were they like before you went on it? Because that's what we're
Mm.
going back to, essentially, keeping in mind they're older and their diet may be different, and like there may be some things that have changed, but we do have to like unmask the real menstrual cycle and see what is happening there. So, and in terms of um, one of the concerns people might experience is, they stop the pill, and then their pill bleeds stop, their induced pill withdrawal bleeds stop, and then like, oh, my period stopped. But it's like, no, you're now just actually giving your body a chance to like, can it have a menstrual cycle? And so lack of cycles or irregular cycles is one of the possibilities coming off the pill. Is obviously others is like pain or premenstrual mood, or we could spend a whole episode talking about all the different troubleshooting you can do around that. But just taking the example of the period not coming, then when I'm working with my patients, the first thing I would say is, well, how actually one of the most useful things I find is, how many years of cycling did you have before you went on hormonal birth control? Because it does take a number of years, actually up to 12 years, which is quite interesting, to fully mature the menstrual cycle.
Wow.
So in the first couple of years, a girl's, 12-year-olds getting her bleeds, they can be quite irregular. That's sort of normal. They're usually what's called anovulatory. So early back in those days, there'd be a lot of estrogen, but no progesterone coming online. So they'll often be heavier. And then, but over time, if all is progressing normally, then they should become, regular and start making a lot of progesterone, which, lightens them and reduces pain and various things. So I'll say to my patients, like, how many did you, and that maturation process is important. So I'll say, how many years of actual cycling did you get under your belt before it was all sort of put on pause? Because that will help tell us, what is it potentially going to be like now. And I do find that even though I've just said it takes 12 years to mature the cycle, the body's pretty resilient. And I have found that even if for patients who've had even 2 or 3 years of cycling as a young teenager, coming off the pill at 32 or something will be a much easier road. Their body will often figure out what it's supposed to do a bit more easily. But yeah,
Awesome. I appreciate that insight. I know that's going to help a
yeah,
lot of people that may be in that stage of life or questioning or, wondering if they should come off of it or not. Or um, I want to come back to insulin resistance really quick. Because a lot of women experience hormonal changes during menopause and premenopause.
yes.
And that often affect insulin sensitivity and metabolic health of women. So, how specifically, how do these hormonal changes during that time, how do they affect insulin sensitivity?
Yeah. So the perimenopause transition, especially the later phases of it, when cycles start becoming genuinely quite far apart, or that is associated, according to the scientific literature that we have so far, with major metabolic upheaval. It's in my perimenopause book, Hormone Repair Manual. I do talk about the recalibration of the whole system. There's definitely a recalibration underway with the metabolic system. It does push everyone towards insulin resistance. So, how deeply they go into it will depend on all the other factors, right? Like how at risk of insulin resistance they already were.
Mhm.
Um, so the mechanisms by which that happens, it's several, but it's the drop of first losing progesterone. So progesterone is a player in all this too, and then losing our main estrogen, estradiol, not losing it entirely, but it does reduce obviously significantly.
Yeah.
And so that's a sort of a double whammy, because obviously, we just talked about how estradiol normally enhances insulin sensitivity. It's a superpower that women of reproductive age have. Um, and then, and also the drop in both estradiol and progesterone also lets testosterone shine through a lot more. So I will just say, for what it's worth, there's a sweet spot with testosterone. Testosterone is good, an important hormone that women have as well. But we do have a sweet spot with that. And too much testosterone in women, and that would be the case in a couple of scenarios. So polycystic ovary syndrome, or PCOS, is one example. There's also kind of a relative testosterone excess that happens in perimenopause. That directly promotes insulin resistance in women, and promotes hypertrophied visceral fat. So this redistribution of fat from the bum, that kind of estrogen fat, to the inside the belly, like the up under the rib cage, and that sort of visceral fat. And that I talk about that quite a lot in my third book. So that is happening to everyone to some extent. There's also going to be changes with, thyroid hormone. There's also, I guess, one other mechanism just to tie it back to, because we talked about gut quite a bit earlier
Mm.
in the interview. One of our main estradiol's not main, but one of its many, many benefits is that it reduces intestinal permeability. It actually thickens the mucus lining in the gut and changes the microbiome. So another effect of having to adjust to a lower amount of estradiol is increased intestinal permeability or metabolic endotoxemia, that thing I mentioned at the beginning, where the inflammation from the gut drives insulin resistance. So
Mm.
the struggle is real. It's definitely real. Some women in their 40s get lucky, I think, and maybe not just luck, but if they're super healthy already, like maybe athletes, or they potentially won't notice this as much. And also I do talk about in Hormone Repair Manual, our ancestors probably didn't have to worry about this too much. A lot of the shift to insulin resistance is in the context of our modern environment, including environmental toxins, the modern food environment, which is already pushing the whole population collectively into insulin resistance. So then you combine that with what happens in perimenopause, and it's, yeah, very real.
Yeah, I believe the narrative, like, first of all, like all of the focus on hormonal changes is becoming so much more louder over the last couple of years. And I
Yeah.
love that so much because I think women specifically need to understand this a little bit deeper, what's going on with their bodies, so they can take a little bit more control. I think for so long, like, personally, like there's just been such the narrative and testing and all the things has been around men, and there's so
Yeah.
many studies around men, and it's like about time like women are stepping up. And I appreciate you and the work that you do, because
Mm-hmm.
it's just bringing more of this insight and knowledge to the table so that women can better understand this and learn about this and gain knowledge on it and be able to take action on whatever they feel like they need to do for themselves. um so with that being said, you mentioned lifestyle
Yeah.
factors, right? You mentioned like toxins and all that stuff. They all play
Yeah.
it like, what role does all of those pressures, lifestyle pressures, stress, how does that all play in driving insulin resistance? And because I think women, like, they think, oh, I have insulin resistance, this is my fault, this is what I did to myself. They have self-blame. They think that they did it to themselves. But like, what role are all these other things
Yeah.
playing into it that can drive
Yeah,
it?
for sure. Great question. And you'll notice chapter one of my latest book is called Metabolic Dysfunction is Not Your Fault. The role that the modern environment plays is massive, but I do want to sort of put that in context. It's not just in the moment in current time. Unfortunately, it's been happening for a few generations. So there are like exposure to environmental toxins, which are probably environmental toxins probably account for about, one scientist estimated about 15% of the epidemic of insulin resistance we're seeing now. Probably food environments responsible for a lot of the rest of it. And some of that food environment could just be things like emulsifiers and ultra processed food, and like sort of detail, and high dose linoleic acid, which is another concern I have. That would be more on sort of on the topic of, what has this massive shift to vegetable oil been doing over the past few generations. And there, so the past few generations have been, something's been going very off the rails with metabolic health, and that is being passed on to future generations via something called epigenetics. I don't want to get too complicated, but I'm just saying, like, what's happening to us in utero, and even what happened to our parents or our grandparents before we were born,
Mhm.
from a metabolic perspective, does get passed on. So this is why we now have kids with insulin resistance and like teenagers with fatty liver disease, which was unheard of, even one generation ago, even two generations ago. So this is where it's amplifying every generation. So this is what I mean by it's not your fault. Some people have been born, unfortunately, just like with very challenged, metabolically challenged in this perspective. They were kind of, their blueprint was laid down to be more vulnerable to insulin resistance, not through anything they did wrong, or not really through anything their ancestors did wrong. It's just like if you live, the food environment you live in is the food environment you eat. That's what we consider sort of normal food. So yeah, it does mean some people have to work a lot harder at it now, which is, I acknowledge in the book, is just not fair. It's not fair when you see some people sort of walking around, they're like, oh, all you got to do is this little bit of exercise and you're fine. And like, you can have a little bit of junk food and it doesn't matter. And like, that's not the real, some people are facing a lot more, some people have to um, make stronger choices around going forward. And I guess there's a chapter quite late in the book on food addiction. So that is going to be probably about 20% of people maybe
Mm.
really struggling have got some degree of um, with their brain and nervous system, they potentially got the challenge of overcoming that. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah, there's I forget what the question was. Yeah, just about how it's not your fault. Yeah,
It's not their fault. Their
people haven't
lifestyle
done this
pressures.
to themselves. They've been born into a world where this is happening,
Yeah.
and yeah,
No, that's a good answer. I believe that too. It's generational and it dates back, and it's from they taking things on in the
yeah,
uteral environment. Totally makes sense.
yeah,
Um, so we touched on a lot here. We touched on
yeah.
like gut health. We touched on metabolic, health and nutritional approaches there at the beginning. We talked about period. We talked about a lot of good stuff here, and I'm excited. I mean, I have your books here. I want to get the period one. I didn't get the period one, so I'm gonna try and find your period one because I'm interested on that. But every we talked about through various different types of things here, and they all present their own like unique. We all present unique shifts, whether it be hormonal or we're dealing with insulin resistance or what have you. So there's got to be some foundational habits or practices that serve women well across like their entire life. So what are some key routines that you would recommend, or dietary habits or lifestyle adjustments or self-care practices? Why don't we just go to self-care practices that you believe that every woman should prioritize to maintain hormonal balance through the different phases of their life?
Well, as you say, there's so many. I mean, a lot of this is in my latest book in Getting What You Need chapters. I'll start with social connection because we are social animals. We really are. And that's true even for those of us who are introverts. It is our body really loves to have, those people, to spend time around those people and get that interaction. And so I just think that's important to sort of prioritize for a lot of
Mhm.
people. Other, I guess, lifestyle things, and I'm choosing some of the ones that in my book I talk about are as the easy fixes. So I rank every metabolic obstacle by high or medium priority and difficult or easy. So anything that are high priority and easy, I'm like, start with that because that is, you can get a lot of mileage for, once you start feeling better by correcting one of those metabolic obstacles, then the feeling better makes it a lot easier to tackle some of the harder ones. So again, I mentioned it already earlier, but circadian rhythm is just such an easy, I don't really use the word hack, but it's just such an easy thing normally.
Mm.
So depending on what latitude people live in, and getting outside in the morning, I think getting some outdoor light is huge for people. And it can be hard if you work full time. I get that, but I'd like, if you have time, like take your coffee outside on the deck, take your dog for a quick walk before work, or like in winter, I know you guys are heading into the shortest days here, so I think there is potentially value in getting us like a full spectrum light of some kind. And certainly when I'm back home in Canada in the winter months, I like having that hit of full light by
Mhm.
preferably by 7 or 8, so or to signal to the body, to the whole body, including the nervous system, the mitochondria, the microbiome, everything, that it's daytime now. So that's an example. Sheltering from blue light at night, timing meals, protein. The timing of protein can really signal circadian rhythm as well. This is why I actually think it's quite important. One of the reasons, one of the many values of having protein in the morning is circadian rhythm. So that would be
Mhm.
true. This is why I'm a little bit nervous about fasting through the morning hours, because then we miss that opportunity to get that, protein to tell our
Preach
nervous
that loud
system.
and clear here, Laura. I
Are
have
you
not
agree?
said
Yeah.
that
Yeah,
either.
so protein. So I do see a lot of people. So I'll just share with you. I'm a meat for breakfast person. So
Okay.
I have been seeing feedback from a lot of people just saying that one thing, like finding a way to eat proper protein in the morning, can be a game changer. I don't know if you probably find that with your clients. Like, and I realize there's this thing now of like, steak for breakfast is this kind of one of the
Yeah.
latest
Steak and
latest
eggs, baby.
things that are out there. And I would agree with that. And so for people, and I guess we'll just offer a troubleshooting tips around that, because I eat leftover meat for breakfast, like whatever's in the fridge from the night before. That's usually what I'll have. And so for me, and the timing of that is so much going to depend on chronotype and just like some people are ready for breakfast at 7 a.m. Some people are not. I'll typically, it depends on your lifestyle. Obviously, if you work from home or something and have the time to have a slower start to the morning, and then maybe meet by 8:30 or 9 might be something that suits my nervous system. But for people who are just, because some of my patients and followers, I say meet for breakfast, and they're just like horrified. They're like, I can't face that in the morning. So it's either then one of two things. Well, usually it's, often one of two things. It's either you're trying to do it too early. Like, I don't think meet at 6:30 is probably too, most people don't want that.
Mhm.
And then the second thing is the state of the digestion. So when the digestion is healthy and the circadian rhythm is aligned, then digestive enzymes kick in. And so, hungry for, some animal protein or being able to eat that in the morning is actually a good sign. So sometimes I'll be like, then with my patients, I'll like, well, let's troubleshoot your digestion and find out why, or your nervous system, find out why you're not ready for protein in the morning. If people really can't face meat, they could do protein powder or something like that.
Yeah. Egg whites.
Yeah. Yeah.
Love that. Good
Yeah.
stuff. Connections with
Okay.
people. So I took away circadian rhythm and potentially
Yeah.
putting in some meat, or definitely a majority getting some protein first thing in the morning, not intermittent fasting or doing fasting in the morning. Thank you,
Okay,
Lara.
good. Okay, so we're all on this. It's good when we're all,
On
it's
the
good
same
when
page.
talking to other experts like yourself, like that's what you see works for people.
Totally.
Yes,
Totally,
it does.
totally.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up here today, which again, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. I appreciate all that you're putting out into the world. It's definitely so important for women to understand their bodies more and more. So as we close, what is the core message that you hope readers and listeners take away from your books and everything that you share about women's health?
Yeah, one of my takeaways is that women's health is not as complicated or mysterious as we've been led to believe. Obviously, I'm a biologist, so as I said, I started out looking at female physiology, pretty much as the normal version of human physiology. So female physiology is logical. We've got it works, and so
Mhm.
we can, that understanding that and can help us to trust our bodies. So
Yeah.
that's actually one of the final lines of peer-to-peer manual is trust your body, play the long game. Your body wants to be healthy.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love that. Well, Lara, thank you so much for coming on to the show today. I'm going to link all your books below. Is there anywhere else where anybody can find you?
Yeah, I'm easy to find. So my blog, which is also the home of I've got a podcast, which is just they're short little like 10-minute explanations of things, is at larabriden.com, and all my social media is at Lara Briden.
Awesome, Lara. Well, thank you so much for your insight, your knowledge, and your education on this topic. I appreciate your time being here with us. Thank you.
Thanks, Nikki. It was great to meet you.
Likewise. Hey, really quick, before you go, I have one small favor to ask. If this episode brought you value or sparked something in you, take just a moment to hit that review button. Your rating and review make all of the difference, helping more women discover the tools they need to transform the fitness and their confidence. It takes less than a minute, but it can change the path of someone else's journey. Thank you so much for leaving that review. I appreciate you so much.